excuses to move on. Like I needed more excuses to be stronger. I'm more worth it, but I've done a lot to prove to those I love that they are good enough. I don't believe in luck, so I am giving up. I hope to find a reason for my fear of feelings leaving at the start. It makes my sleeping harder. I don't know much about you, so I'm trying not to doubt you, but in time I know you'll let me down, and that is fine. A feeling I can't shake, it's getting stronger. I'm more bothered, but I've done a lot to prove to those I love that they are good enough. I don't believe in luck, I don't believe in much. Leave it all to trust, I'll start to give it up.
Hi everyone, thank you for taking time to come down this evening to join us for today's event. I'm Zing from SGInnovate, and today we are very happy to collaborate with our longtime partner, General Assembly, to bring you today's event. At SGInnovate, we believe Singapore has the resources and capabilities to tackle hard problems from around the world, and part of our efforts includes knowledge sharing session like the one you're here for today. So without further ado, I'll hand over the mic to Gabriela from GA, who will start us off. Gabriela, please.
Hello everyone, my name is Gabriela and I work for General Assembly. We are very happy to be here. We love to be at SGInnovate. We love our events here about AI, deep tech, data. May I know how many of you have attended General Assembly event before? Hands up. Oh, nice, so many familiar faces. For those who don't know us, we are a technology education company. That means we are focusing on teaching people applicable skills about data, coding, digital marketing, design, and similar. So if you want to learn something new, please go to ga.co, and you can find many short workshops, long-term courses about various technology topics. And if your company is looking for a provider of corporate trainings, talk to me too. I am very happy to chat more and show you how we can help. And today we will be talking about very important topics. It's data privacy in a customer-centric world. And we have 4 experts from various companies that will discuss insight, hot trends, and what is good to do and what your company shouldn't do. So let me introduce our moderator who will lead the evening. It's Joydeep from Holmusk. Applause.
Hello, everyone.
And he will introduce all panelists, give them little space to tell you something about themselves, and then he prepared very interesting questions. So, and in the end, we will have Q&A, so prepare some questions too. Thank you so much, and have a good evening. Bye.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is Joydeep. I work at Holmusk. We are another startup, healthcare startup in Singapore. So we live in the data world, so this issue is actually quite personal to me both, and it's from a professional perspective also, it's very relevant. We have a good lineup of experts here, and it would be great if you guys can maybe introduce yourself and maybe say a few words about, you know, what do you do in this world, and what you feel about the whole world of data privacy and issues around that.
Hi everybody, I'm Sandy from Rakuten. So for those who don't know, Rakuten is a group of companies which is mainly internet-based services. We do e-commerce, we do video sharing, and we have the whole lot. So to us, data privacy is very important, of course, given the fact that a lot of these things happen on the internet. So I'm from the Global Privacy Office, representing the HQ in Japan.
Hi, I'm Tharishni, and I represent Aon as their APAC Privacy Director. So privacy is my bread and butter. This job didn't exist 10 years ago, so it's pretty cool to have a job that didn't exist 10 years ago. Unlike a lot of the startups here, I actually work for a large evil corporation called Aon. They'll take that tongue-in-cheek, I'm sure. And so if you've got any questions, I guess it's from a legal perspective that I can answer.
Hi all, I'm Mona Zoet. I have my own company, RegPac Revolution. We really promote the whole regulatory technology ecosystem through a couple of initiatives. And of course, one of those initiatives is actually also data privacy solutions in a way. We are building a marketplace where we list all the solutions and where you can actually subscribe to so that you can look for the solutions yourself and contact the companies that actually providing those solutions. We do also these kind of events, very tailor-made to RegTech, and we are housed in the dedicated FinTech Hub, 80 Robinson Road. I'm very curious today because I'm not so much of a very data privacy specialist, although I actually started with data privacy within my previous work house 10 years ago. So I'm very curious to learn how it all has been evolved, and maybe I can say something about it as well.
Awesome, thank you so much. So I wanted to, the one thing I do want to avoid with these panels is to make them dry. So let's actually have some fun around it. So I wanted to start by getting everyone to just, engage us. So, we data privacy, and we all use social media. So let's say we talk about Facebook, we talk about LinkedIn. How many do you think knows who owns the data that we actually give out to the world when it comes to Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn? All right, one person seems to know. All right, two. Let's say healthcare. Who owns the data in healthcare? Okay. And our browsing history. Even more discovered. Okay, so I told you, and that's a good place to start because I think these are things that most of us use, and maybe that's a good place to start, that when we talk about, let's say, data privacy within the world of every one of these contexts that we just described, maybe we can start off by saying, why should we care about data privacy when it comes to each of these? Where are the boundaries of this conversation that you guys can help us set so everyone just at least understands what are we talking about here?
I guess I'll go. So there are two separate concepts that we're talking about, and they can be commingled. The first is the concept of data protection, and that's really sort of the legislative impetus in this part of the world, which is commerce. How do we protect data so that we can get more data? That's Singapore, that's Hong Kong, that's Malaysia. And then you have the fundamental right to privacy, which is the European context. Now, in terms of why you should care as much as you want to care. Privacy ultimately is how much you want to give out and how much you want corporations to have your data. So this, if anything, that's a theme that, when I do my job is, do people care about this type of privacy, and how do we allow individuals to enforce how much they care about their personal privacy against corporations? That's how I would put it.
So let me pick up on that. So when we say how much people care, maybe one way of approaching that is to maybe if you guys can pick up a few examples of what are the kinds of things that we should care, because I could be sharing something and not knowing how it might be good or bad for me. Can we talk about some anecdotal examples of things where people don't understand and they end up in a pickle?
So, when we talk about corporations, right, how many of you represent corporations that collect data before you even know what you want to do with it? Because a lot of times, so that's one of the big things that changed in the GDPR, I think. You're forced to think about how you want to use the data before collecting it. A lot of times you have all these data and you're like, okay, great, how do we make use of it? And then the question comes in, what can you do with it? So that is the difference in terms of mentality, in terms of what you can, how you want to do it. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems, because I think a lot of our data scientists also want to know how to do some testing on it, right? So these things need planning ahead on what do you want to do with the data, what's the scope that you can use this data for, and making sure that that's communicated over to your end users. I think that's something important.
Yeah, and I think if I can chip in there, it is not only what can you do with the data, but I think it is also more like, till what extent do you understand what you can do with the data? Because I have a startup. I can give a very simple example. I have 13,000 people on LinkedIn, right? That is more or less my USP, my database. But I didn't get those people on LinkedIn probably to also maybe do a lot of marketing or sales for a certain product, because they maybe only consented to me to just be my connection for exposure or whatever. So when I start to use that data really for marketing purposes, in the sense of trying to sell in training or whatever, did they really consent to that?
So
it goes back to what you're saying is intentionality of the data.
And I think one of the concepts that the law has really taken, real interest in is privacy by design, because privacy by design is now mandatory if the GDPR applies to you. And that's really the thought process in how you're collecting data. Sometimes the question isn't what can you do with data, but the question is what can't you do with this data? And understanding those parameters and justifying how you're using the data versus the harm to the individual, that's really important when it comes to, I guess, what you should be interested in.
So you said the magic words, right? GDPR. And I know most people will have heard the word GDPR. So maybe we can start a conversation, because I think we changed the landscape to a certain degree with GDPR coming to play. And maybe if we can spend maybe a few minutes and talk about, what was the world before GDPR? What is GDPR in a few lines? What are the elements of GDPR that are most important to know? And then we go from there.
So this is GDPR speed dating, is what you're saying. Okay. So we'll start with Mona.
It is all about consent for me, right? And also that you can actually decide yourself what kind of data is being used from your own data. What kind of data do you want that people know about? And of course you have then all those rights.
So for me, GDPR is knowing your data and how you're using your data, especially personal information.
And then to me, GDPR is about putting the accountability back into the whole system, and the thing that pinches about the GDPR is that they actually have this big fine that they were going after companies for. So there's both the carrot, that's the stick eventually to make people move, because if you're thinking about how this enforcement takes place, there is that fine and there's that stick to make you move. Otherwise, we're just talking about concepts, we're just talking about laws, and then how it will actually pinch you. That is something that is painful about GDPR as well, that potential.
And can I just add, in terms of why GDPR has become a buzzword even in Asia, is the extraterritorial application of the GDPR. There's been a lot of misconception that the GDPR applies if you process EU citizen data. It's actually EU resident data and offering products and services. And if you are a startup that targets individuals, whether they can pay in any currency in the EEA, for example, the products can be shipped over to the EEA, the GDPR does apply to you. And that's why it matters, because you have, we were hinting about sanctions. It's 4% of global turnover being the maximum amount, as opposed to a couple of hundred and a slap on the wrist.
So, honestly speaking, from a novice perspective, most of the time when we hear all of these things, it just goes left, right, and center, to be honest, okay? It's like, and I was talking to them about it, it's like the 22 pages of fine print that I say yes to without knowing, and it comes to my place, and I just scrap it and, shred it and get rid of. If I had to talk about privacy from, let's say, GDPR or any of these kinds of laws or protections that I should be careful about when I give consent, where I should be careful about when I am being asked and I have to say yes? What is the 3 or 4 keywords in there that I should care about?
And that's one for you.
I mean, first of all, figure out how do you get out of the thing. Not a lot of people think about that. There's always going to be the address of the data protection officer. That's what these laws are for. You don't have to go to court to sue someone in order to get your way. You send a message or an email to the data protection officer and say, I don't agree to this. I want to use your platform, but there are a couple of things in there that I'm not okay with. I think knowing that as your first recourse is really important. The second part is the GDPR makes sure that you give meaningful consent. So having pages upon pages of a privacy notice doesn't mean that the corporation is fully clad and ironclad against any claims that come against them. If they haven't brought it to your attention and they haven't made your consent meaningful, that means that it doesn't matter if they've got your consent, because if it's a situation where you can't opt out, so you get your new iPhone, very expensive, and you can't, use your product without agreeing to the full terms, that doesn't mean it's legally defensible against you every single line in there. And I think that's what a lot of non-lawyers don't know, is that if it's not brought to your attention in a meaningful way, it doesn't matter.
So just to add on to that, the thing about the GDPR is that it shifts a lot of that burden from the consumer, the user, back to the company. So it's for the company to prove that they have done and they have brought this to their attention. The users are aware, the users have recourse, and so that's why it's impacting companies a lot.
But let's say from a novice perspective, what do I care about? What do I look for?
Number one, don't agree to marketing. I think that's what everyone does. We untick the marketing box.
Only
Okay.
if you're really interested, then
Yeah,
check it.
exactly. I mean, sometimes marketing is actually quite good, right? So, I mean, but when do you know that the marketing is actually then meaningful? Like, I mean, what we already said, I fully agree with your statement. Like, a lot of those privacy disclaimers, more or less, they have 20 pages, and you can say, only meaningful work, that is okay. But 9 of the 10 times, I mean, you want to buy that computer, you have to go scroll through those rules and regulations, and you do, yes, because you think it is as it always is, right? It is not all of a sudden one company just has one pager. It is not. So then, for me, it's like, on the other hand, if we really talk about rules and regulations and laws with regard to privacy, if I need to get my business up and running and I need to earn some money, I don't want to be worried about those 20 pages of privacy agreement that I have to sign off, and later on maybe see that I breached some kind of clause that I even didn't know that, that was important. So how can we try to change that then?
Yeah, so that goes back. I mean, so there, from a, I'm sure there are other people in this community who represent startups, and I've heard this several times, and this becomes very stringent, especially when you go into healthcare often, is is privacy and protection and all of these terms getting to the point that it's becoming a burden, especially on smaller companies, to be able to do things. Just because I want to do something, I now have to go through incredible amounts of legal stuff to just know what I'm allowed to or be compliant. Is it a burden? Is it a burden that's there? Does it actually stifle innovation? Or is it a burden that is necessary to a certain degree? Like, to me, as a layman, I always think about analogies, right? And the classic analogy that I think about is fuel standards for cars. You can look at it from the perspective that I raise the bar, and you could say that's going to be really bad for the industry, but actually we find out that, oh no, it's actually very good for the industry when you actually raise it. So putting privacy standards like this, is that bad or is that actually good?
I mean, this is my bread and butter, so I'm going to defend it. But it is good. Look, a lot of corporations in the past didn't care what they did with people's data, didn't care where it sat, didn't care about its cybersecurity. And I think if corporations and startups are meant to think about these things, it's for a very good reason. Like laws like this aren't to protect corporations, it's to protect individuals. And like I said before, it's up to you to go to, it's very easy to make a complaint, it's very easy to go to a commissioner. Unlike other laws that you need to actually go to court and hire a lawyer to defend your rights. That's why the exposure for privacy is much bigger than any other exposure when it comes to legal issues. And also, it's a very good thing because ultimately, people monetize everything that you can get. So we've seen corporations that, startups like OneTrust that has come up with a privacy management program that grew from 1 employee to 500 employees in the last 2 or 3 years. You've got Microsoft and Azure, for example, understanding the data localization requirements, setting up cloud service providers in countries that require data localization. They'll charge you more money for it, but that's how they make money. And so I think it's not a space that's exclusive to corporations, it's a space for startups to grow as well if you want to get people compliant, and I don't think it's a bad idea at all. It's a burden, but everything else is a burden as well. Like, you can't just say, well, privacy is a burden. Well, so is anti-competition, so is money laundering, for example. So all of it is just the same basket.
And I think for startups especially, maybe the legal concepts behind it sounds very scary, but if you look at it back at its essentials, all the different laws actually talk about privacy as concepts. And these are things that you don't need, the specifics you need lawyers to deal with, but in terms of context and you're applying it locally in your companies, you don't need lawyers to do that. Processes, knowing what data you have, knowing where the data goes, that knowledge itself is something that is operational and is something that I think it's easier to start at a startup than a company with tons of legacy systems. When you start from a startup, I give this analogy like starting with a clean home. You don't need a big house to have organization. A small house is easier to organize, right? So that sort of thing is something that I think you should look at the positive side of for startups, and it's not something that you should be afraid of. I think it's easier, in fact, to put this all the way from ground zero.
Okay, so let's say I find out that my data privacy or whatever law I'm under has been breached. As a consumer, since we're all talking about at the end of the day, I'm a consumer. What's my recourse? Should I do something? Can I do something? What are the limits of it?
Well, if you're in America, you join a massive class action suit. So in these parts of the world, what happens is you will be offered certain recourse by the corporation that has leaked your data, whether that's credit monitoring, whether that's a compensation, etc. We haven't seen large payouts to individuals. A lot of time the fines are on the corporation to make sure that they fix the systems, etc. And for an individual to be successful in their claim, you've got to prove that there's a massive, breach to your, it affects your day-to-day life, you've lost money, etc. And that's what the credit monitoring is for. But also, it's not a system where you're going to get a lot of money back. It's more about you're going to get a lot of your rights back, which is intangible, unfortunately. Yes, sir. Sure, and I get why people think that. And I get why there's an asymmetry, and that asymmetry is not going to go away anytime soon, right? And it's really about having the legislative protections against it. Because either your argument is that there shouldn't be any legislation, or what you're saying is we need better laws in place, or you're saying there is a legislative solution. It's just all of these people that have been discussing it haven't come up with one. Now, I don't want, no, I think it's going to be a one-on-one discussion if I keep hearing. So let's agree to disagree on that. I think GDPR was not the first attempt. We had the EU directive. What the GDPR did was the fact that 20 years ago, the internet was not used as widespread as it did, and now it is. Now, one thing we need to understand about how laws work, it's never going to be a perfect system. With the way technology is moving rapidly, can there be a perfect law that really addresses it? And that's why a lot of the provisions in the GDPR or any privacy sort of law or data protection is a broad concept. And it takes these concepts and lets corporations decide how they are going to implement that and how they're going to get consumer trust. And one of the biggest issues you've seen in the last few years is the cases against Facebook. Now, you have Cambridge Analytica scandal. If Facebook was to say, well, we're going to shut down because of Cambridge Analytica, is that the solution that we want? Because these questions happen. At the end of the day, like I said, privacy is really what you make of it. And if you decide not to use these platforms, great. If you decide to tell Facebook that I want to use your platform, but I don't want these things, if you say that to Facebook and they don't comply within 30 days, you can go to a commissioner and then Facebook gets into trouble. That's exactly what happened with Max Schrems. So the reason that there was even the GDPR and the Privacy Shield being annulled was because one guy who's now 31 years old, but he was 27 when he went against Facebook and the Privacy Shield, he was able to do that without having a large army of lawyers behind him. And that really speaks to the power of individuals and why corporations are scared, because an individual doesn't need a large army of lawyers in order to make a complaint and to make a dent in these laws. Personally, I can tell you that I've had to spend quite a few days dealing with individuals who are unhappy with how we're dealing with these laws. Right? It's not the kind of days where you have to send me a lawyer's letter and then the legal counsel shows up. I have to show up because one person has made a complaint about how we're using their data. You can't make those complaints necessarily with anti-money laundering, for example, or even having a breach of contract, etc. So I think it's a small step. It is what it is. But I don't think we live in a utopian world where someone can give me an answer on how we solve these problems. I think it's how we move forward. So absolutely, and you know what? The awareness piece is severely lacking, especially in this part of the world. But as I mentioned before, one of the things you want to look out for is the privacy notice must have an email address and a phone number for you to call up, or an actual, physical mail address. That's where you address your complaints to. So under the GDPR, you have the right to rectify your data. You have the right to limit the processing of your data. You also, in this part of the world, should be told what's necessary for the service and what's optional. And I think a lot of corporations forget that. You also have the right to completely delete your data from a system. So if you decide I don't want you to use Facebook, you get to tell Facebook, hey, also, you need to delete my data. What the corporation on their side actually have their hands tied is that they can't keep data forever. That's a retention principle, and they have to have a plan to delete your data. So no corporation is allowed to keep your data forever. So that's one of the rights that you need to remember. Now, how corporations use your data, that's a different story. And that, we can talk about de-identification and analytics in a bit, but those are the main rights. So you can actually have access to your data as well. So you can email Facebook and say, I want an entire dossier of exactly how you use my data, and they have a certain period of time to provide that. So there was an article about a journalist going to Tinder and received something like 80 pages of how Tinder uses their data. So that's really what you can do with the corporations that have your data as well.
Well, that's good. We at least got the audience engaged. So related to that, you just mentioned on the idea of what they can do with the data, right? And it goes back to consent, as far as I understand, and I think the GDPR also speaks to being very clear about the consent. And I know this because also that, even inside Singapore, there have been changes internally, not because they're necessitated and it's not universal, but different organizations, healthcare organizations have changed their data use policy in a sense that, I know it from my experience that, across the world, we often see that who are the custodians of our healthcare data? The hospitals. Very rarely ever do we actually think about that me as a patient, I'm the custodian of the data, or I own the data. Most of the time, the hospitals own the data. And as long as it's de-identified, oh, hell, go for it, okay? There have been changes to that. I'm sure there are similar things around this that go back to the idea of what can I do with the data. So when as a startup, let's say, as a company, if I collect data and I want to use it for another purpose, how do I know when that purpose is beyond, and if it is beyond, is there a recourse? Or do I basically say, oh, hell, I can't do it? Any ideas?
So I think we've covered the recourse portion quite a bit. So maybe
it's more about the ethical part.
Yes. So there's different concepts for data privacy, right? We're talking about compliance, basic compliance with the law. If the law doesn't cover it, too bad, Then there's also the consumer-centric version, which is if your consumers would jump, then yes, I will do it, right? And then there's the data ethics part, thinking beyond and thinking about it before the customer even realizes that it's something that affects them. So it depends on where. So within your company, of course, you have different priorities, and where you peg your priorities is one thing. Of course, you have to plan for the future, and that's where you take that tagline, I would say. And in terms of what we are talking about the recourse, right? Again, beyond the law, if you want to provide that access to your customers, because trying to peg it to different formats of law is difficult, then it's something that we can do, we can plan from the start.
But so are you saying that we need to plan 3 years into the future of how I'm going to use my data?
Depends on how much your company uses data. If your company is like Facebook and you plan to mine all that data, I would say it's something that you need to look into seriously. Of course, if it's something that you use it for very basic purposes, then yes, I think you can use it for the basic purposes. You don't intend to do anything too exciting with it, then you can keep to that basic line of where you have to do a balance, right? How do you not, because especially for companies like startups, you have different priorities. You have to do the weighing balance in terms of like which ones, where you focus your abilities, your resources to, because you never know how long your startup will run even. So that's why you have to do that balance between innovation and privacy. You have to be clear on how do you drive this company further down the road, but not miss out on what you have in the moment.
But I guess if you talk about consumer-centric, right? So then actually you should turn it around. I mean, I guess if you are probably not sure whether you can actually use that data for another purpose because you're actually asked to use the data for a different purpose, then you probably have to go back to the consent again, right? To use the data again. And which is, in a way, from a consumer perspective or from a company perspective, a burden, because do you have to ask all the time consent, right? So.
And I think that's where the de-identification piece comes through. I think everyone who does any data analytics knows that you don't need personal identifiers to identify people. If you're a corporation, you have Chinese walls around who can access the data. If you have the identifiers, then the analytics guys don't have access to the identifiers. And the additional security that's involved, because the laws basically say, when you protect data, it's proportionate to the risk that is provided in terms of the type of data. So, for example, to your healthcare, that's a huge risk, right? And you need to have additional security around it. Credit card details, for example, additional security. So if you actually have less incentive to have personally identifiable information, and you want to actually have proper mechanisms in place to ensure that the data does not tie back to an individual. And Singapore is really helpful with that. The government says, if you don't have, here are various methods to de-identify or mask data. And if you don't have any products to sell to an individual, there is no intention that helps to say that you've de-identified it for good.
So let's say this idea of what is de-identified data and what can be used once it has been de-identified. Do you think the standards for these are relatively set and across different industries they're relatively the same, or do you think all of these questions about usability and what is de-identified and what can I do with de-identified data and all of this actually is kind of still evolving, and if you go into different industries, you'll see different standards being used these days?
I think this is my favorite phrase, there's a cool to creepy continuum when it comes to technology. And I think if you hit the creepy parts and people care, that's when you get into trouble. And that's really sort of because ethics is never black and white, it's a spectrum. And so when you hit the creepy parts and you know that people are gonna care about it, even if when they don't understand the full extent of it. Great example, Cambridge Analytica. Very few people actually understood what was going on with the whole scandal, but they were creeped out by it. And that's the sort of thing that, ethics at the end of the day, a lot of people think, you need a philosophy degree in it. I just think if you understand how human beings work, how the modern day person cares about their data, you try not to do those things, or make it at least palatable for people because at the end of the day, it's a gift to get model when it comes to data. I give my data in order for me to get something that is of commensurate value. And if I don't think it's commensurate, I'm gonna find this creepy, I'm gonna make a huge fuss out of it. Hillary Clinton emails, for God knows why that's become an issue, right?
Questions, anyone? No? Okay. I just find it very interesting because even in across different countries and even across different, I personally come across very different standards of what, and so as a consumer, sometimes I want to understand where we're going. We talked a little bit about laws, about the fact that the government comes in with laws. Is that the right model? Like, can we actually always expect governments to come up with the laws at the pace at which technology and all our cool to creepy ways of using data is changing or evolving? Is that a model that you think in the long term will work?
It's a hard question, and no, it's not the best way for things to work. At the end of the day, I think the legislators will try their best, and that's not to say they shouldn't be doing anything, but it's a self-regulating market, right? And as we talked about before, if you can kind of make money out of it or make people care about it, then that's the best model. But at the end of the day, you can't have a completely, self-regulating market either, and that's where the legislators come into place. Because if they don't, the asymmetry that we talked about earlier would be even bigger. So how do we bridge the gap for that asymmetry? I think, unfortunately, that's the best recourse that we have, the governments that we elect.
And I think that was the point that our friend there was alluding to right now, because it's true that the companies do have a lot of data. They do have a lot of power in terms of that data, and the governments are only playing a catch and mouse game, cat and mouse game. So what that's why there's different stages for this whole privacy thing, right? Like I mentioned, the compliance and the data ethics part. And if you're a big enough company and you use the data for creepy ways, then it's true that you will get the lashback sooner. And I don't think it's a case of like, just sit down and like cross our fingers and hope we don't get caught. In this day and age with social media and everything, the consumer trust can go down really quickly. And you know, as long as you have ways to justify what you're doing and they are legitimate ways, it can actually help your company in the long run as well. So some of these principles that are similar across laws, like data minimalization, purposes, all these are actually concepts that if you don't look at it from a bad angle, it's actually something that can help you. If you don't need legacy data, why are you still holding it? Anyways, in this day and age of data, all these data is irrelevant quickly anyway. So just it's hygiene. If you think about it that way, I think it will be a bit more useful.
Yeah, because I mean, the reason why I ask is because laws change what? Every 5, 10 years? Technology changes on a monthly basis nowadays, right? So as consumers, in a world where we know that the laws are going to eventually catch up, maybe in jumps, in between, how do we keep ourselves up to date to know better? How would you advise everyday users as they're going through to be kind of a little more aware, a little more on guard of whatever you want to say, however you want to say, of the things that are going on, so you know that your data is not being misused?
You know, I do think you have to educate yourself, right? I mean, if you doesn't matter whether you're in innovation or whether you're in the regulatory side or just a small business. I mean, the world is changing. I mean, that's a fact. And technology is always much faster than rules and regulations and policies and procedures. So at the end of the day, you need to educate yourself to make sure that you actually at least understand the basics of GDPR, or at least understand what privacy is for you as an individual, what kind of data you would like to share, what kind of data you definitely don't want to share, and how are you going to go about it. I mean, we are all smart people. I think we need to self-regulate ourselves as well, whether it's from risk management perspective or data privacy perspective, it's all the same.
And if you're a consumer that is actually interested in this, you can take a look at Facebook and Google's, because they're big companies, right? They spend a lot of time and money trying to do the education to you guys so that you guys don't jump. You can take a look at how they have how they have planned their privacy settings out, what are they trying to educate you about, and then that way you can kind of see what is important to them and what you can do with your data. And I think we have a question.
Sure. I think you're talking about the trust mark system that Singapore is about to have. The trust marks are really important for e-commerce because, so for those who don't know, trust marks are basically when a country decides that you can go to an accountability agent, they're going to audit your processes, you submit it to them, and then you sort of get like a seal of approval that says you have passed this particular standard. And so you're seeing more Asian countries have it. So Japan has one, Korea has one, and so does Singapore, and people are starting to apply for it. So I think it does help to kind of educate consumers if they know what the trust marks are about. Because I think that's the problem with kind of what's happening right now in Singapore is the government's kind of taking small steps around, raising awareness, mostly around corporations actually being aware. I don't think that's the right way as well. I think it needs to be also very individual and consumer-centric to teach them about what their rights are. The catch with this is that Singapore and Malaysia have some of the most unique privacy laws because they don't apply to the government. So for example, Sing Health breach, guess why you didn't hear a lot about that? It's because that was a government entity and the PDPA doesn't apply to the government. And so there is that tension between the government and how they want to educate individuals about their rights. Oh, sure. No, that's definitely not what I was implying. I was implying the PDPA in its controls and its rights of access from an individual perspective does not apply to the government. The government does have its own standards under Cybersecurity, Official Secrets Act. If you're under the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the MES, all of that is still applicable. It's just that the PDPA itself is not applicable. And so if you're looking for your rights in there against the government, that doesn't work, is all I'm saying. Yes.
That just, yeah, please.
Sorry, can you repeat one more time the question? About well, from at least from my perspective, I think the best way to look into blockchain technology at this point in time is from a trust perspective. But I do believe that we are not that far yet evolved in a lot of use cases that we really can say that blockchain technology is really, the real deal. But especially from a privacy and data security perspective, if it evolves in the way that we hope that it evolves, it will be from a security perspective and anti-fraud perspective a very good tool to be used as an infrastructure.
So it has the promise.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that yes, there are groups that are looking at using blockchain in order to increase accountability. I think it's still very baby steps right now. Most of it's being used for the contractual purposes, general legal sort of blockchain stuff, but nothing very specific that we've seen out in the market yet.
But we're talking about, when you are referring to, you're talking about the final extent of blockchain where everybody kind of owns their own data and it's a distributed ledger, and anybody asks for it, they have to ask me to share my token for them to have. That's like really the farthest end of the use of that.
Identity.
So just one rather complicated topic, I guess, on this thing, because you brought up government. We talk about the lack of balance and all of this, and we know that, let's say in US, every time your data crosses US boundaries, NSA gets a copy of it. For all practical purposes, everybody's Gmail is with NSA just because Google, not because I asked them to, shifts things around. And so every time it crosses US boundaries, just because Google's doing that, they can have access to it. So while we talk about this idea of privacy and we talk about it, let's say, for the purposes of specifically maybe organizations or companies when there's monetary incentives, where do you think the legal the laws or the applicability of it or the boundaries of it, when do you think they will cover governments also? Or do you think that's never going to come because they're the ones who are designing it anyways?
I think it's a little bit unfair to put governments in one bucket, like they all think the same. I mean, the American government is very different from the European governments that have gotten together, and Singapore, very different as well. So I think you got to scope that down, because I don't think I want to answer a question about all governments acting the same.
I completely no, but in the sense that that the fact that often enough when we talk about these privacy laws, we really focus on other organizations. So the focus becomes very Facebook, Twitter, and banks, and all of this. It rarely actually talks about the other side of it, which are with the governments themselves. And so one of the questions I had is, like, as a citizen, where are the laws and how do they apply when it comes to government bodies having my data? Is it the same or is it different? And is it completely all over the place and there's no standard whatsoever?
I think you need a regulator on this panel to be able to represent the governments to answer that question. But maybe I'll just say my point first. I think the governments amongst themselves, they cannot agree clearly, which is why Safe Harbor, the US, the old US and EU data transfer mechanism got brought down precisely because of the US government's involvement in it. So it's clear that they are not happy. And there's releases about Vietnam's new cybersecurity law and access to data because they want to keep data in Vietnam. They say all data generated in Vietnam must be kept in Vietnam. And that data localization issue is a very governmental issue because precisely because governments want access to that data, this is why it's in there, same as China. So if you're talking about why governments want the data in the definitely, my opinion on it, yeah.
I mean, it just from the perspective of why we say, you know, there's a tendency to sometimes say, like he said, imbalance and all of this. The imbalance always is somehow the black guy is a big corporation, and
I think you had a
Yeah.
hand up earlier.
Separate common question, but in the past we've seen a lot of government regulations imposed some pretty onerous compliance onto companies. In the long run, it introduces standardization and transparency, which I think actually benefits most industries or ecosystems. I don't know if you guys see any path to that sort of outcome with GDPR, BEP, and all these other regulations, but thinking about it long term, where might that go, where it introduces better efficiencies in industries?
No, I completely agree. I think when I was talking about knowing where your data is, that I think creates efficiencies, first of all. Some of the moves that regulators have done, recently the New Zealand government, for example, published how they came up with the decision to move their Microsoft Outlook and the privacy by design process that they went through. So I think the regulators are kind of trying to show people how to do things. And if you sort of take these standards and go back and do those, the same standards and how to do things, it will create efficiencies, because right now I feel, when we look at how corporations, you was talking about, you have a big house, you have a lot of data, it's all over the place. We're running up costs in terms of data retention, whether that's physical or electronic data, the mass volume in terms of where we keep data. A lot of that needs to come into play when you want to comply with these laws. So I think it's teething problems right now. Ultimately, I think when we come to a different stage collectively, that's when you start seeing the efficiencies and moving forward from there.
Yeah, and to add on that, I do think, for instance, that in Asia, at least a few companies in Asia, we started much later with regard to look into, privacy. And of course, Singapore had already banking secrecy, but there are a lot of, countries in Asia were really not interested in privacy for many, many years. If you, for instance, compare it with Europe, Europe already has privacy laws in place for a very long time. But, okay, it got much more sophisticated in a certain way, and you can question whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. But, that imbalance, more or less, that awareness, that still needs to be created, and not only from governments. I think companies need to do that as well. If you have all those policies or requirements, why you buy that thing, you actually should explain what to the customer, right? If you sign this, you are consenting with X, Y, Z. I mean, it's not really difficult to actually add that to it so that people understand, okay, apparently this is the way to go about it. I understand what my rights are now, so I can move on. And I think that kind of awareness is still not there on this side of the world.
And I think that's the question of meaningful consent. And one of the things that Facebook actually has done, which not a lot of people know, is they created a design lab. So I attended their event last week where we were given various different apps, and how do we meaningfully get consent at every single point of interaction, so that the more amount of data you want, because that's what you want to get out of the app, for example, how do you make sure that the individual actually, from a design perspective, and this is really where the lawyers need the help of people in technology and people in design. How do you actually take these legislation and then put it to a consumer in a meaningful way. Because ultimately the GDPR says, unless you have legitimate reasons to use that data, everything else is consent. And if an individual doesn't understand that they're giving consent, because capacity to give consent is very important. So from a design perspective, I think that's something that collectively we all need to do. And if you want to check out some of the things that the Design Lab has done, it's all open source and it's all online. So you can Google the TTC Labs. I don't work for Facebook, but I thought it was a really great event because anyone, even if you weren't part of the event, you can see how people start thinking about privacy in a design context and making sure that individuals understand what's happening within the ecosystem.
Right, and to bring my comment back to your question about whether the regulators are trying to standardize, I think they are, but I think realistically there is still going to be differences because different countries, so privacy is it's very tied with culture, right? Privacy speaks differently to different people. And of course the governments have to represent that. And they have their own kind of different levels of what is important to them. So there will be some standardization, and I know in Asia at least, there is some effort to try and standardize certain things, but there will still be that gap that you mentioned. And I think this ties back all the way to what the gentleman behind said just now about accountability. In the end, it's about accountability and trying to drive that. And I know that, based on my discussions with regulators, I know that certain regulators, especially the Singapore ones, are very interested in that concept. So that's something that we can probably see in the next PDPA amendment. Yeah.
I think we're up with time, so thank you everyone, and thank you panel for being here, and thank you everyone who came here and spent the time with us. See you next time. Bye-bye.